All right, welcome to the deep dive. Today we're diving into the world of, well, this might be a new name for some of you, Giambattista della Porta.
Yeah, he's a fascinating figure, especially when you look at him through, a philosophical lens, even though he might not be the first name that pops into your head when you think philosopher.
Right, but that's part of what makes this deep dive so interesting. Because, back in Porta's time, the 16th century, philosophy wasn't quite the specialized field it is today.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. It covered so much more ground back then.
Porta was this, super curious guy right in the thick of all this intellectual change happening, stuff that would eventually lead to the scientific revolution.
And he wasn't just reading dusty old books. This guy was out there getting his hands dirty, really digging into what our source calls the scientific underworld, the world of crafts and objects and even alchemy.
It's like he was trying to understand the world by taking it apart and putting it back together, kind of like a philosophical tinkerer, I guess you could say.
Yeah. Exactly. And then on top of that, he wasn't just writing dry academic treatises. I mean, he did those too, but he was also into writing these really cool plays.
Mannerist comedies, right?
Yeah, those. And some folks even think he might have influenced Shakespeare.
Wow, seriously. That's wild. I mean, it just shows you how this guy's mind worked.
Right. Total Renaissance man in a way.
So for this deep dive, we're going to try to unpack some of Porta's big ideas. We'll look at his work on natural magic, and we'll get to what that actually means in a bit. His theories about physiognomy, judging character by appearance, and we'll even touch on his work with optics and memory.
All while keeping in mind the world he lived in, the other thinkers around him, the limits placed on what you could even talk about back then. It's a pretty wild ride, philosophically speaking.
All right, so to kick things off, let's talk about this whole philosophy thing in Porta's time.
Sure. Back then, philosophy was a huge category.
Not just ethics and logic, the stuff we usually associate with it today.
Right. It was more like this giant umbrella covering everything from cosmology, the study of the universe, to meteorology, physics, biology, psychology. I mean, really, anything that tried to explain the world and our place in it.
So to understand Porta, we got to step back from our modern categories and look at him in that context. He wasn't just some kooky magician. He was using the intellectual tools of his time to grapple with really big questions.
And he wasn't afraid to challenge the status quo either. He was engaging with all sorts of alternative ideas, not just sticking to the accepted wisdom of the day.
Okay, so let's talk about this natural magic thing.
Right.
I mean, that's got to raise some eyebrows for any modern philosopher.
Right. But Porta was very careful to distinguish his natural magic from ceremonial magic, the kind of magic that involves spirits and rituals and all that stuff.
So no, casting spells or summoning demons.
Nope, not for Porta. His focus was on the natural world, on figuring out how things worked and how to manipulate them.
So in a way, it was kind of like a proto-science.
Yeah, you could say that, but it's more complicated than that. He definitely believed that there were hidden forces at work in nature, what he called occult properties.
Occult? Doesn't that mean supernatural?
Well, not exactly. For Porta, occult just meant hidden, something not readily apparent, like the way a magnet attracts iron or a plant grows towards the sun. These were occult properties, not because they were magical in a supernatural sense, but because they weren't immediately obvious.
Okay, so the magus in Porta's world, the person practicing this natural magic, what were they like?
Porta's magus was this super interesting hybrid, part craftsman, part scholar, part alchemist, with a dash of astrologers thrown in.
So they needed practical skills, book smarts, and maybe a bit of intuition too.
Exactly. It wasn't just about knowing the right spells or incantations. It was about understanding the hidden workings of the natural world and using that knowledge to do things.
And how did Porta define this whole natural magic thing?
He had this great analogy. He compared the magus to a peasant farmer.
A farmer? What does farming have to do with magic?
Well, think about it. A farmer doesn't create the plants, right? They prepare the soil, they plant the seeds, they water and weed, but ultimately it's nature that does the growing.
So the magus, like the farmer, is working with nature's inherent powers.
Precisely. They're not trying to defy nature or break its laws. They're trying to understand and manipulate them to make nature do what they want it to do.
That's a pretty sophisticated way of thinking about it, actually. And our source mentions that Porta's ideas about natural magic were also connected to applied Platonist metaphysics, I mean, that sounds pretty heady.
Yeah, it gets a little complex, but basically Porta was working within this framework where the physical world was seen as a reflection of like a higher spiritual reality. It was this idea that everything in the material world was a kind of shadow or copy of a perfect, eternal form that existed in the realm of ideas.
Okay, so like the perfect idea of a tree exists somewhere, and then the trees we see in the world are like imperfect copies of that idea.
Exactly. And according to this view, there's a whole hierarchy of being, with God at the top, then angels, the human soul, and so on, down to the material world. And everything is connected, with the lower levels reflecting the higher levels.
So where does the Magus fit into all of this?
Well, the Maragas, by understanding this hierarchy and the way these different levels are connected, could manipulate the material world by working with these, like, spiritual forces or energies that permeate everything.
Okay, so it's not just about mixing potions or saying the right words. It's about, like, tapping into this underlying cosmic order.
Right. It's about understanding the blueprint of the universe and using that knowledge to your advantage.
That's pretty wild stuff. But Porta wasn't just a theorist, right? He was also a very practical guy. His book, Magia Naturalis, is full of all sorts of interesting recipes and instructions.
Oh, yeah. That book is a treasure trove of weird and wonderful stuff. He's got recipes for, like, incubators for hatching chickens, ways to improve the camera obscura so it doesn't flip the image upside down.
Wait, the camera obscura, wasn't that like a really early camera?
Yeah, basically. You know, it's that thing where you have a dark box with a small hole that projects an image onto the opposite wall.
Right. So Porta was messing around with that, too.
Oh, yeah, he was all about it. And he also had recipes for beauty treatments, ways to make perfume, even methods for supposedly roasting animals alive.
Roasting animals alive, that's a little intense.
It is. And then there's the recipe for a magic lamp that uses hair fat as fuel and supposedly makes people take off their clothes.
Whoa, that's a party trick I've never heard of before.
Yeah, you got to be careful with that one. And on top of all the practical stuff, Porta also loved telling these incredible stories, you know, about weird phenomena and unexplained events.
Like what kind of stories?
Oh, you know, things like a raging bull suddenly being calmed by a barren tree, or a hyena's shadow silencing barking dogs. He really tapped into this, like, fascination with the marvelous that was really big back then.
Right, it's like those old books full of wonders of the world and strange creatures and like that sort of thing.
Exactly. And Porta became a bit of a celebrity for collecting and popularizing these stories. He was like a proto-science communicator, I guess you could say.
And this was a time when there were all these professors of secrets running around.
Oh, yeah. Those guys were everywhere. They were like the traveling salesmen of knowledge, selling remedies and sharing supposedly secret information about all sorts of stuff.
So Porta was kind of like one of them, but maybe a little more academically inclined.
Yeah, he definitely had more of a scholarly background than most of those professors of secrets. But he also knew how to play to the crowd, you know? He knew that people were fascinated by these weird and wonderful stories, and he was happy to provide them.
And he wasn't just like pulling this stuff out of thin air. He was also drawing on artisanal practices of the time, things like distillation, to try and make sense of the natural world.
Oh, absolutely. Distillation was huge for Porta. He saw it as a way to concentrate the, like, hidden powers of nature, to extract the essence or spirit of a substance.
It's like he was using this very hands-on practical process to try and unlock the secrets of nature.
Exactly. And that brings us to another really important concept for Porta, the idea of signatures.
Signatures, like writing your name on something.
Not quite. It's the idea that the outward appearance of a thing, its shape, color, texture, all that stuff, reflects its inner nature, its hidden properties.
So, like, you can tell what something is good for or what its powers are just by looking at it.
Yeah, that's the basic idea. And this concept was central to Porta's work on physiognomy, you know, judging character by appearance, which we'll talk about more later.
Okay, so everything has a signature that tells us something about its hidden nature. That's pretty cool, actually. And what were the driving forces in Porta's universe? How did he think things worked, you know, at a fundamental level?
For Porta, the universe was driven by two main forces, attraction and repulsion.
Like a cosmic game of push and pull.
Yeah, exactly. He even described the universe as a kind of giant animal with both male and female aspects constantly interacting through these forces of attraction and repulsion.
That's an interesting image.
Yeah.
And this idea of attraction and repulsion was also key to his understanding of how magic worked, right?
Absolutely. He believed that everything was connected through these forces and that the magus could manipulate them to achieve certain effects.
So what was the prime example of this attraction thing for Porta?
Well, the lodestone, the magnet, was a big one.
Right, because magnets can attract iron without even touching it. That was pretty mysterious back then.
Yeah, it was. And for Porta, it was proof that these hidden forces of attraction really existed. He even incorporated some newer ideas about magnetism from another scholar, Leonardo Garzoni, into his work.
So it was like he was always updating his theories based on new information.
Yeah, he was always trying to stay on top of the latest discoveries.
So the magus, in Porta's view, is kind of like this cosmic matchmaker, using their knowledge of these forces to bring things together or push them apart.
Exactly. And he even compared the magus to a farmer or animal breeder, deliberately manipulating nature to produce specific outcomes.
And he was also really into technologies that could induce visions, right? Like ways to alter perception and create these extraordinary experiences.
Oh, yeah. He had all sorts of recipes for drugs and special lamps that were supposed to do that. And he even had a recipe for a witch's flying ointment.
A flying ointment, seriously.
Seriously. And he was also fascinated by the camera obscura, not just as a scientific instrument, but also for its potential to create wonder and astonishment.
Right, because the images it produces are kind of like halfway between real and imaginary. It's almost like a magic trick.
Exactly, and that's what Porta loved about it. It was a way to manipulate perception, to create these illusions that blurred the lines between reality and fantasy.
Okay, so let's shift gears a bit and talk about Porta's work on physiognomy. I mean, what exactly is physiognomy, for those who might not know?
So physiognomy is the idea that you can judge a person's character, their personality, their inner nature based on their outward appearance.
Like by looking at their face, their body, their...
Exactly. And it wasn't just about humans either. Porta believed that this principle applied to, everything. Plants, animals, even the planets themselves.
Wow, that's pretty ambitious. And Porta was a big believer in physiognomy.
Oh, yeah. He was a huge proponent of it. He even wrote a whole book about it called Phytognomonica, which focuses on the relationship between plants and human characteristics.
Plants and humans. What's the connection there?
Well, the idea was that plants, like people, have certain characteristics that reveal their inner nature. So, for example, a plant with thorns might be seen as aggressive or dangerous, while a plant with soft, delicate leaves might be seen as gentle or passive.
And Porta thought you could apply those same principles to humans.
Exactly. He was basically trying to create this universal system for reading the signs of nature, this kind of grand, unified theory of appearances, if you will.
And what did Porta's contemporaries think about all this? Did they take him seriously?
Well, it's a mixed bag. Some people thought he was onto something, that he was pioneering a new science, but others thought he was, a bit of a quack.
But his ideas were influential, right?
Oh, yeah, definitely. His work on physiognomy was widely read and discussed, and it even influenced later thinkers who were working on things like linguistics and comparative anatomy.
Okay, so let's get into some of the specifics of Porta's physiognomy. How did he actually go about reading people's faces and bodies?
He was all about looking for patterns and resemblances. He'd compare a person's features to animals, plants, even the planets, and then draw conclusions about their character based on those comparisons.
Can you give me an example?
Sure. He said that men with dark complexions, what he called a saturnine complexion, were more likely to end up in prison.
Why? Because they look like shadowy criminals or something.
Well, partly, but he also associated that complexion with certain animals that were considered dangerous or melancholic.
So it was like a whole web of associations, right?
Exactly. And he also placed a big emphasis on beauty. He believed that beautiful people were more likely to be virtuous and successful, while, people with less aesthetically pleasing features were more likely to be let's just say not so good.
So it was kind of a judgmental system in a way.
Yeah, you could definitely say that, but
Yeah.
You got to remember that this was a different time with different ideas about beauty and morality.
Right. And Porta's physiognomy wasn't just about reading static signs, right?
Mm-hmm.
He also believed that people could change over time.
Absolutely. He was very aware that things like diet, environment, even illness could affect a person's appearance and character.
So it wasn't like you were stuck with the face and personality you were born with.
Nope. Porta believed that people could change for better or worse.
It's actually kind of a hopeful view in a way.
It is. And it also shows that he was thinking about the the dynamic interplay between nature and nurture long before those terms became popular.
And how did his physiognomy relate to astrology, which was also pretty big back then?
Well, Porta was trying to, naturalize astrology to bring it more in line with his scientific worldview.
So he wasn't like a total astrology skeptic.
Not exactly. He thought that the stars could influence people, but not in some mystical, supernatural way. He believed that you could, read a person's astrological chart by looking at their physical features, their signature, so to speak.
So he was basically saying that the planets and stars influence people through natural, observable means.
Yeah, that was the basic idea. He was trying to find a way to reconcile astrology with his understanding of the natural world.
And our source mentions that Porta's physiognomy also had a connection to his work in the theater. I mean, how did those two things go together?
Well, Porta's plays often featured characters with very exaggerated physical features, almost like caricatures.
And those features were meant to reflect the characters' personalities.
Exactly. It was a way to, visually communicate the character's inner nature to the audience.
That's pretty clever, actually. Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here, but Porta had even more interests beyond natural magic and physiognomy, didn't he?
Oh, yeah, this guy was never bored. For instance, he wrote a whole book on ciphers, those secret codes you use to send messages.
Really? So Porta was like a Renaissance spy master.
Chuckles. Well, maybe not quite. But he was definitely interested in the art of secret communication. And his book is actually considered one of the first to give detailed instructions on not just how to create ciphers, but also how to break them.
That's pretty impressive. And it probably came in handy if you wanted to impress powerful people, right? You know, like, hey, I could decode your enemy's messages.
Yeah, that was definitely a valuable skill to have back then. And it fits with Porta's overall persona as this guy who was always uncovering secrets, always trying to figure out how things worked.
And what about his work on memory? Our source mentions that he had a rather unique approach to that, too.
Yeah, Porta's memory system was all about using vivid imagery to create, mental hooks for information.
So instead of just memorizing lists of words or numbers, you'd create a picture in your mind.
Exactly. He called them memory palaces, these elaborate mental spaces filled with images and symbols that would help you remember things.
And he even recommended using graphic erotic imagery as a memory aid.
He did. He figured that those kinds of images would really stick in your mind,
That's certainly one way to make sure you don't forget something. And speaking of not forgetting things, what about Porta's contributions to optics?
Well, as we mentioned earlier, he was really into the camera obscura, not just as a scientific instrument, but also for its theatrical potential.
Right, it's like a magic show and a science experiment all rolled into one.
Exactly. And he also worked on developing early telescopes, although he don't really get the credit he deserved for that until much later.
And it's fascinating how he approached optics from this very hands-on experimental perspective, right? It wasn't just about theory for him. It was about, building things, tinkering, seeing what worked.
Totally. And that hands-on approach actually led him to some pretty important insights about the way lenses work and how images are formed.
And then there's distillation, which we talked about earlier in the context of his natural magic.
Oh.
It seems like that process had a much broader significance for him.
Oh, yeah. Distillation was like a master metaphor for Porta. He used it to understand everything from alchemy to meteorology to even social reform.
Wait, social reform. How does distillation fit into that?
Well, he saw distillation as a way of purifying things, of removing impurities to reveal the essence. And he thought you could apply that same principle to society, like getting rid of corruption and injustice to create a more perfect world.
So it's like this idea of distilling society down to its best, most essential elements.
Exactly. And there's even this weird detail about how he thought you should use different shaped alembics, those distillation vessels, depending on what you were distilling.
Like a bird-shaped alembic for distilling bird-related substances.
Yeah, something like that. It all goes back to this idea of signatures, that the shape of a thing reflects its inner nature.
Okay, and last but not least, we got to talk about Porta's work on meteorology, the study of weather. It sounds like he approached even that with his signature experimental flair.
Oh, yeah. He was all about building these intricate models and contraptions to try and recreate weather phenomena in his lab.
Like creating mini rain clouds and stuff.
Pretty much. He was trying to figure out, how rain formed, how wind worked, all that stuff. And he used these experiments to support his theories about how the natural world operated.
So, in a way, he was kind of a proto-meteorologist, too.
Definitely. And his work in meteorology also ties back to his interest in natural magic, this idea of understanding and manipulating the hidden forces of nature.
It's really remarkable how all these different threads of Porta's work are connected, how he was constantly weaving together these ideas about nature, art, technology, and the human mind. So for our philosophically inclined listeners, what's the takeaway here? What's Porta's place in the grand scheme of things?
It's tricky, right? Because he doesn't fit neatly into our modern categories.
Right, he was doing science, but also magic. He was a philosopher, but also a playwright, an inventor, and like a dozen other things.
Exactly. And for a long time, he was kind of dismissed as a dilettante, someone who dabbled in a lot of things but didn't really master any of them.
But that's starting to change, right? Scholars are starting to appreciate Porta's work in a more holistic way.
Yeah, they're realizing that his eclecticism, his willingness to cross boundaries was actually his strength. He was able to see connections that other people missed, to synthesize ideas from different fields and create something new.
And he wasn't just working in isolation either. He was part of a whole network of thinkers who were pushing the boundaries of knowledge, people like Francis Bacon, William Gilbert, those guys.
Right. And Porta's work was also controversial in its time. He had to be careful about what he said because of, the church and all that.
Right. Censorship was a big deal back then. But Porta managed to navigate those tricky waters and get his ideas out there. And those ideas had a lasting impact, even if he didn't always get the credit he deserved.
Exactly. So I think for philosophers, Porta is a really interesting case study in the evolution of thought. He shows us how philosophy was practiced in a different time, how it intersected with science and magic and art in ways that we might find surprising or even strange.
And he also challenges us to think about the boundaries of knowledge. Where does science end and magic begin? What counts as legitimate knowledge?
Big questions. And Porta's work doesn't give us easy answers, but it does give us a lot to think about.
Okay, so to wrap things up, here's a final thought for our listeners to ponder. Given Porta's attempts to explain seemingly supernatural phenomena through natural means, attributing them to these occult but natural properties of the world, how would a modern philosopher evaluate his approach? Does his focus on the observable, even when it's filtered through this idea of hidden forces, offer any insights into how we understand the relationship between science and philosophy today? It's a question that takes us to the heart of what it means to know something, to understand the world around us.
And it reminds us that the boundaries between what we consider science and magic aren't always as clear-cut as we might like to think.
Porta's work is a reminder that the pursuit of knowledge is a messy, fascinating, and often surprising journey.
And that sometimes the most interesting discoveries are made by those who are willing to look beyond the obvious and explore the hidden corners of the world.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the world of Giambattista della Porta. Until next time, keep exploring.